Hello, everyone. Welcome to Futureproofing Conversations. This is a new series designed to explore the future of work, where we'll be speaking with pioneers, disruptors, revolutionaries, and inspirational leaders on how they're challenging conventions and leading change in the world of work. In this first interview of the series, I am delighted to share a conversation with a truly inspirational leader. Obi Felten leads early stage projects at X, which is the Moonshot arm of Alphabet, of course, the parent company for Google. It's an incredible place where self-driving cars were initially conceived. And in this interview, we cover a huge amount of ground on some fascinating topics. We talk about failure and really how to truly embrace this in a team culture. I know it's a topic everyone talks about, but there's some practical examples we really get into that are incredibly inspiring. We talk about the importance of diversity, how to really handle different people working together, how to harness collective intelligence to solve the difficult, complex challenges that they're working on at the moment. And we talk about the challenges as well of innovating and collaborating remotely and what the future of work holds for Google. So with that, I hope you enjoy listening. Welcome. Hello, everyone. Obi, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Obi leads early stage projects at X, which is Alphabet's Moonshot factory. It's a team of inventors and entrepreneurs working on projects that will radically make the world a better place. I love that. There's some amazing projects we can get into and hear more about. But you're responsible for getting these early stage projects out of the lab and into the real world. I understand Obi and X obviously is famous, I think most notably probably for being the first people to start talking about self-driving cars, which now seem like we're very much on the horizon of almost on the roads, I suppose, in some places already, but also internet from stratospheric balloons, air deliveries by drones, and most recently looking at creating a biomarker for depression. So some fascinating stuff we're going to get into. But Obi, I'd love to go back in time if that's okay, and talk a little bit about one of your first projects and how it shaped you as a leader, because I understand when you were at eToys, it didn't all necessarily work out so successfully. Maybe we could start there, and how did that sort of shape you as a person and as a leader?
Right. I love that you're starting with a failure, going straight there. Thanks, Ben. It's really lovely to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So I studied philosophy and neuroscience at Oxford in the early 90s, when everyone told me that was a completely useless degree. I then went into strategy consulting because I wanted to learn about business, and it was a really great way of rapidly learning about loads of different things. And it was the time when the internet started to take off in Europe in the late 90s. So when all of my friends went to business school, I decided to go into a startup instead. And the startup I chose was called etoys.com. They were as big as Amazon. You know, Amazon was selling books, we were selling toys. I loved the people. And I jumped in and became a product manager, helping to launch the UK side. But then I became the general manager for Germany. And so I set up the company, I found the office, I hired all the people, we localized the website and so on. But then a week before we were meant to launch in Germany, our board back in California met and said, you know, you're running out of money, you need to stop this European expansion. So I had to tell everyone that we were not launching. I had to fire all the people that I had just hired and sold on this e-commerce dream. You know, some people had long-term careers in retail and had sort of taken a risk on this. And that was a really big failure very early in my career. I was 28 at the time. And it really shaped me in that I'm still afraid of failure, but I know it's never the end. It's always the door to something else. Many of those people went on to work for eBay, which was expanding in Germany at the time. And actually really valued their experience of having such an early e-commerce experience, and as did I. So I went on to work with brick and mortar retailers, taking them online in the early 2000s.
So it didn't seem to sky you too much, that early, but actually potentially was a catalyst, was it almost for, would you
Yes,
say?
and it's also, I think you learn a lot more from the failures, because it's quite rare. When we have a big success, everyone celebrates the success, rightfully so. But you don't typically sit down and say, okay, what are the lessons from this? Whereas if you have a big failure, you sit down and you think about, like, what could we have done differently? What went wrong? What might have been the reasons? And you never quite know all the reasons. There's a lot of serendipity in both success and in failure. But I think we're more analytical when it comes to failure than success, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and I think I've heard you use the phrase, is it failing gracefully on the path to success? So I wondered if you could share, what's the reality like? I mean, telling people that, their project's going to fail, or that you're not going to fund the next phase of the development at X, like that must hurt people a little bit.
Yeah.
Must be
so
quite
let
challenging.
me go back a little bit. So this kind of this topic is so important to us at X because we work on very audacious things, right? We call them moonshots for a reason. So we want to solve very large problems in the world with the help of technology. So if you're working on something that's really audacious, many of our projects sound like science fiction in the beginning. You talked about autonomous cars. When we first started working on them, people literally referred to it as a science fiction, right? They had been around in sort of science fiction and literature for decades, and there was a lot of academic research that had gone into autonomy, but nobody had taken it out of the lab and into the real world. And that's what we did when two academic teams came together, one from Stanford and one from Carnegie Mellon, to build a car that truly could drive itself. And the project spun out of X, it graduated, it's now its own company called Waymo, and they are providing real service to people in Phoenix and Arizona. So within a decade, that has gone from science fiction to reality. I mean, of course, it's early days, they have to scale. It's not going to be overnight in every city in the world, but it's a huge step forward. Now, on that path, there's many failures. So for instance, the car team first was building a car that was not fully autonomous. It was actually only what in the industry is called level 3 autonomy. So the driver is still in control. And if the machine fails, the driver has to take over. And when we did the tests on those cars with other people from Google actually, who volunteered to use the car on their commute, we learned two things. So one is people relied on the car almost instantly. So they were not paying attention anymore to what was going on the road. As soon as the car was in self-drive mode, they would check their email, they would lay back and relax and so on. So this idea that the machine could have the human as a backup was actually deeply flawed. And that reset the entire program, because we then sort of restarted with a prototype that was called the Firefly, which was fully autonomous. And there's a huge difference between level 3 autonomy and level 5 autonomy, which is what the team went for. And so that kind of accepting that kind of setback and almost starting over from scratch is very, very hard. So you have to create a culture where, one, people are able to design these kind of experiments, and B, where it's okay for them to accept it if the experiment doesn't go the way you want. And so that's a lot. We've spent a lot of time at X thinking about how do you create that kind of culture that enables this radical innovation. And I wouldn't say that we've cracked it, but there's definitely some lessons that we've learned along the way.
I mean, love to hear them. So would you mind sharing?
Sure. No, absolutely. So I think the first lesson was that it's so inevitable that you are going to fail along the way, that accepting that is something that's really useful to do upfront. So there's a great quote that's attributed to Thomas Edison. He probably never said it, but it's still great. And he said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work." So I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. Think about that, right? 10,000. And so in order to do that, like, one of the things we found is that it's really important to work on the hardest things first. And that's very counterintuitive, because as humans, when we make our to-do list, or, as a project team, when we make the list of things that we want to work on, we often go and gravitate towards the things that we know we can solve. and then we can tick something off the to-do list, or we can show progress to our boss or our investor, and we feel good, right? But what if your project fails in the second year because you then encounter an obstacle that's so big that you can't overcome it? Wouldn't it have been better if you'd worked on that obstacle, that problem first? And Astro Teller, who is our captain of Moonshots, who runs X, he coined the phrase, it's a sort of image of the monkey on a pedestal. So imagine you want to train a monkey to recite Shakespeare while standing on a pedestal. What do you work on first? Do you know how to build a pedestal? So it's very tempting to build a pedestal, but it's much harder to train the monkey to speak English, let alone recite Shakespeare. So the monkey is where you should go first. So that's become a phrase at X that people are talking about monkey first, and they talk about like, this is the monkey that we're working on. So they describe their most difficult problems, and that's both the ones that are hard to solve and the ones that we have no idea how we're going to tackle. Those are the monkeys.
That's
so working on those first.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess I have a little background of working in an innovation lab, and I would say a lot of kind of corporate business innovation labs probably have quite a modest, if at best, record of success. And you kind of compare that with X and some of the examples you've already shared. I wonder also, with the background of a lot of great innovations you hear of, happen almost discovered by accident. A bit, right? With penicillin to microwaves to X-rays, LSD apparently even was discovered by accident. I wonder, is there anything in terms of the process? So you've obviously talked about like starting with the biggest, hardest problem first, but also how do you allow people to experiment? Is it kind of free reign experimentation or very quite structured and systematized?
It depends on the stage. So as projects move through our stages, you can imagine it's like a funnel. So in order to produce one autonomous car company at the end, we have to start lots and lots and lots of projects and experiments. So the earliest part of the pipeline is highly experimental. There's very little oversight. People can come up with an idea and start a project with very little money, but also very little sort of permission. So it's very bottom up. Lots of the projects come from ideas that we might have come across at an academic conference or reading a paper, etc. So that's the other thing about innovation. It's never truly original, right? When somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, I've just invented this thing in a vacuum," that's never true. It's always a derivative of things that are already out there. And then as the projects move through the pipeline, there's more oversight, because as we're starting to invest more, the teams get bigger, the investments get larger. Of course, there's more oversight. So I think that blend is quite unique, because many companies make the mistake that they put a huge amount of effort up front, right? Like you have to have a business plan already and know what kind of product and business this is going to be. Our explorations in the beginning are incredibly experimental. They often start with a technical insight, and kind of thinking about how we can make money comes much later. So ultimately, we want to create companies that are meaningful companies within the Alphabet group. And so that's a very high bar, right? Because the first Alphabet company was Google, which is one of the most phenomenally successful companies of all time. So eventually we have to figure out how we can marry purpose with profit. But in the beginning, we're very much just focused on, can we solve a problem here? Is there a breakthrough technology? Because that happens to be our particular area of expertise. And so kind of by blending these kind of two models, like a lot of freedom at the beginning and then introducing more rigor gently as we go along, I think you can have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, interesting. And do you encourage sort of people to sort of freely choose what it is that they work on that they care kind of passionately about? Or does that actually end up kind of causing problems down the line?
No, I think that's important. I think
Okay.
it's important. You need a fire starter or an entrepreneur who really is passionate about solving a problem. So for instance, we had a number of climate change problems, and people were sometimes so passionate then when X was no longer wanted to work on the project, they actually took it out as their own company, and they spun out as startups. So that entrepreneurial passion that's almost unreasonable is incredibly important, because you hit so many obstacles. So unless you have one or two people at the core of that project who truly believe in it in an almost irrational fashion, I don't think it goes anywhere. I mean, that is what entrepreneurship is all about. You then marry that, and this is where like our advantage of being, you know, a moonshot factory. So these teams aren't working on their own in isolation. There's other people that they can learn from. There's, you know, finance people and strategy people and business development people and so on, who they can tap into, who also sometimes provide like a dose of reality. And when I first came to X, I was one of the first non-engineering hires. So everyone was an engineer or a scientist, and they were mostly focused on all of the technical problems, like how do we make the balloons fly, right? And I asked a lot of the non-technical questions, like, is it legal to fly balloons over countries? Have you talked to any governments about this project? Do you have a business plan? Are you going to partner with the phone companies or compete with them? And nobody had any answers to those questions. So when I asked Astro about these, he said, oh, why don't you come and help us? These are great questions, and we need somebody to address those too. And that's actually how I first came to X. And my first role at X was to build out all of those teams that looking at the non-technical parts of the problem.
And you mentioned some projects, you know, that end up spinning out or people leave because they're passionate about it. What would be that for you? What would be your kind of, is there a project that you're like most passionate about now? I know Project Amber, I think is the title for what you've just been working on. So
I can talk a little bit about Project Amber. So I'm a generalist. So I love lots of different areas. I have worked, you know, in a huge range of different industries. You know, I've worked on consumer internet early on. I worked in e-commerce. At Google, I worked on consumer products like Chrome and Android, etc. And then at X, I've worked, you know, on everything from cars to drones to climate change projects, etc. But the two problem spaces that I'm personally most passionate about, because I think they affect the world so much, is number one, climate change. You know, it's one of those live or die ones. Like if we don't address climate change within our generation, then the world really truly will be a worse place. And you know, I think we owe it to ourselves, but also to our children and our grandchildren to not leave them a worse future to deal with. And they're becoming very vocal, right? Like you listen to teenagers like Greta Thunberg, they're saying like, don't screw it up for us. So that's one area. And so two projects that were in my group called Malta and Dandelion did end up as independent startups. Malta is about energy storage. So one of the issues with wind and solar energy is that it's not dispatchable. So it gets produced at different times than when the grid actually needs it. So if you can store that energy either within a 24-hour cycle or even over weeks and months in a cheap, efficient way, then you can make it dispatchable. And Malta's breakthrough tech was to use molten salt. So it turned the electricity into thermal energy, and then you can turn it back into electricity later using turbines. So it's kind of like hydro, but without a mountain, you can put it anywhere. And that's now a thriving startup. They spun out so that they could partner more broadly, and I think they're about to raise their next round of financing from venture capitalists. The other one was called Dandelion, and that's an interesting story because Kathy Hannon, who founded that project, had actually founded another project before, which is one of our most famous failures. It was called Foghorn. And Foghorn was about making carbon neutral fuel. So imagine you're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. In our case, we were pulling it out of seawater and then combining it with hydrogen to make a fuel that you can then burn in any car. And it was an extraordinary idea. I loved it because there's over 1 billion cars in the world that are not going to be replaced by electric cars anytime soon. So you could make these cars at least carbon neutral. So when the fuel burns, it gets released back into the atmosphere, but you've removed the CO2 in the first place. And that team was really interesting. They were highly analytical and they set themselves loads of technical goals, but they also set themselves a business goal, which was they wanted to make the fuel at the same price as oil-based fuel. And when we started the project, the oil price was at $100 a barrel. And when it came down to 30, the team actually came to me and they said, we don't think this project makes sense anymore. The price on carbon would need to be huge for this to be viable. So we think we should shut it down. And the reason they were able to do that is because they didn't just have success criteria in mind when they started the project, they also set kill criteria. So they said, if this kind of thing happens, we should shut this project down. And they had hit their economic kill criteria. And the interesting thing about kill criteria, which almost nobody does, right? Everyone sets success criteria. They imagine what the world would look like when they succeed, and that's great, and so do we, right? But it's incredibly useful to also set these kill criteria, because it gives the team a lot of autonomy and a lot of power, because then you're no longer arguing about whether you should shut the project down. You're basically arguing about whether you've hit your kill criterion. And when you have, then you agree you should stop the project. And it doesn't have to be the entire project, right? It could be like one experiment or like a new feature that you're trying out. But having these kill criteria is very powerful, because it flips it from your boss says, I'm not going to invest into this anymore, which is very frustrating and leads to, anger and denial and bargaining and so on, to the team actually being able to do it themselves. So in all of my teams, I've always tried to set these kill criteria so that we have clarity amongst ourselves of, when does it no longer make sense to work on this? And people often think of it as like a terrible thing. And yes, it is. It's not a pleasant thing. And we do let people go, by the way. Like when we shut down a project, we basically make everyone on the project redundant. Many of them find jobs on other projects, so it's quite rare that people leave.
CV, so it's not so bad
that people leave. But it's still, it's a proper process that you have to go through. And I've learned that you actually have to grieve while you're doing it as well.
Absolutely.
It's just like celebrating success, like grieving a failure is a kind of important part of digesting it and making sure that you take the lessons.
Fascinating. Now, I mean, there's some of these things that you're working on, incredibly smart people in your teams, incredible like technology and big goals that you're trying to solve. What about the challenges? Like if you had one, what's the kind of hardest thing? I wondered if sometimes is the most frustrating thing working with regulators or people that just don't quite see the bigger picture or something like this. I saw in the self-driving cars that they still had to have wing mirrors or something on the
that was quite funny. When we built the first autonomous car, the California regulations, we showed it to the regulators and they said, where's the steering wheel? And we said, well, you don't have to have a steering wheel. It doesn't say it in the regulations, but it did say that you had to have a wing mirror. So the car had a wing mirror. It just didn't have a steering wheel. They didn't buy it. They made us put some sort of joystick back in so that the safety drivers that we had in the car initially were able to kind of stop the car. But yes, the wing mirrors was definitely kind of a funny thing. I think all of those things are surmountable. So for instance, regulation is often cited by startups as like a huge barrier. We found that with a collaborative approach of working with the regulators early, and it's a sort of bit of a back and forth, right? You have to explain this technology. The technology is still emerging. So it's actually very difficult to come up with regulations for something like, stratospheric balloons or autonomous cars. And so it's a dance, like you're going back and forth, you're explaining the technology, they kind of make clear what's important to them, which in the case of the cars, it's really clearly about safety, right? Like you don't want to put lives at risk. And so then the project sort of evolves alongside. I don't think that's it. I think the hardest thing is what we've been talking about. It's the culture. Like it's the powerful forces that cause humans to retreat to the comfortable and the conventional. And how do you get your employees to maximize their creativity, their talent, their personal sense of purpose, but also to work together as a team? And that's the other thing I think about innovation, is that people often sort of think of it as this genius inventor who invents something and comes up with this light bulb moment. That is not my experience at all. It's teamwork, and it's a sort of process. You try things, you fail, you try again, etc. And it doesn't matter how creative or clever you are as an individual, you have to work with other people who challenge you. And that is how the bravery comes about. So like being brave enough to try things that sound unconventional, and then also being humble enough to walk away from it when it's not working out. Otherwise, everything is a waste of time. And this kind of like this idea of like working as a team, I think has been shown so many times, right? Including like predicting the future. So there's been studies on predicting the futures, and even experts are incredibly bad at predicting the future, but teams are actually much more accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm such a huge believer in having unconventional, diverse teams with like multifaceted backgrounds that you throw together and point at these problems, and you're going to make much more progress than as an individual.
Fantastic, because I imagine there's been a big shift over the last, since you joined X to now, about diversity, and you said it was a lot of like kind of technical people, maybe all from Stanford with computer science degrees. Is it sort of still, I imagine it's come an awful long way since then, but are there any perspectives you still think are kind of lacking in X or areas?
Well, look, it's a journey, right? So like, I would say we have come a huge long way. But this is one of those things where you'll never be perfect. Like, so it's not like you reach the state of nirvana and you're like, we're done, right? Partly because we're constantly forming new teams. Like, we're always starting projects, so there's always new people coming into the factory. The diversity aspect is important to me, and it's not just about gender diversity or people of color. That is important, but to me that's almost like a shorthand, because these people bring very different experiences. They've had different experiences growing up, right? And so you want all of these different perspectives in a team, so that you can have a team that is challenging each other and kind of creates this creative friction that I think is really important. If you have everyone who has a similar background, right, whether they all went to the same university or have the same kind of degree or look the same, you're going to just get so much more agreement and you're going to miss things. So that's like my biggest fear always as a leader is, am I missing a piece of data that is actually the thing that we overlooked, right? That's going to sink the thing. And the chances are much lower if you have a diverse team. So in my team, for instance, on Amber, on the mental health project that I worked on, we had neuroscientists, we had academics, we had people who'd worked in industry all their lives, we had prototypers, we had hardware engineers, we had software engineers, we had someone who'd worked on medical devices as a product and clinical lead. Now, they disagreed a lot of the time, right, about how we should do something.
With mental health issues, or was that, I guess, like people
Actually,
I'm sure you
a number of the
to a lot,
people in the team had lived experience of mental health. So I think that's if you're working on something like mental health, you by default like attract them. And then in addition, we did a ton of user research. So, I personally probably talked to over 100 people, both clinicians and people with lived experience of mental health. So yes, I think that's really important to like bring the end user of the product that you're trying to build into the product development process very early. And nowhere is it more important than in health and mental health, and it's very overlooked often. So they often sort of said, like, no one agrees with me. And I said, yes, that's the intention. Like, if you all agreed with each other, like, we wouldn't be as productive.
Yeah, it can create some sort of tensions and frictions. Like you mentioned that as the challenge. Like, how do you then get diverse teams working together productively? Are there some rules that you have to put in place? Is it more about just making sure kind of the culture's right, or there's a process for?
No, there's definitely there's cultural elements. So one of them is about empathy. So just reminding people that you have to put yourself into other people's shoes. And I think that's applicable to the world at the moment. I'm in America, which is so divided at the moment. And when you listen to the inauguration speeches yesterday, they were all about like creating some sort of unity, and it's about understanding the other person's perspective. So I think that's the number one. Listening to each other's perspectives. So making sure that everyone has a voice at the table, that there's not like some people who are really loud, who are drowning other people out. That's the second thing. And then how you debate things is also interesting. So as we switch to working in a distributed fashion, the kind of classic way of like resolving conflict is you get everyone in a room together, right? Now we can't do that anymore. So how do we do that? How do we make decisions in this sort of remote environment? So I found, for instance, that like using docs is incredibly useful. So writing down what we know so far, writing down what the decision is, and then inviting everyone to add comments, and then reading through the sort of comment threads and making the decision at the end and summarizing it. So what that does is it actually allows people to engage with the decision making in an asynchronous way. So it's not like whoever happens to be in that meeting or whoever happens to speak up the loudest in that meeting is heard. Like the comments all have the same noise level, right? Like you can read everyone's comments. You can add them in whenever you want. So if like today you have to be taking care of your kids and you're going to log on after they're in bed, you can still contribute your voice. So I think some of these techniques actually make work a more inclusive place. And like as we're shifting our working styles to those kind of ways of working rather than the traditional ways of working, right, where you have like a meeting and the most important person like sums it up, I think it's actually going to make work a much more inclusive place.
Yeah, and is that, I'd love to hear how you found kind of working in the lockdown in coronavirus sort of times. I assume predominantly or 100% remotely.
So we were all 100%, and you know, Alphabet locked down early. Like I think they were one of the first companies to sort of support social distancing or physical distancing, which I think is the better way of describing it, because we still need social contact. We just need to physically be apart. Yeah. So we all went to work from home almost overnight. Yeah. Now, for many of us, that was actually fine, right? Like we're in the knowledge economy. We already had laptops. We already like used, you know, Google's G Suite, and you know, so we have like Gmail and Docs and calendars, etc. We didn't have some sort of clunky VPN. Like everything always worked seamlessly because in our company already people were sort of partially working from home. So for instance, I've like worked from home 1 day a week ever since I started in 2006 at Google. And so we were kind of set up technically to do it. But of course, culturally, X was a place where we very much had one building where we all came together. Like we have this building, it's called The Rails. And if you could see it, it's designed for this kind of collaboration. So we did very deliberate things, for instance, like putting the cafe in the middle of the building. So the cafe was a meeting place where at lunchtime, people would bump into each other serendipitously. Now that's like one of the things we're missing. The other teams that are struggling is the hardware teams, right? So we have a lot of labs where we do a lot of prototyping. And so obviously it's much harder to move your lab to your home or your garage than it is to just move your laptop.
And have you put in anything in place? Like you mentioned the benefits of like writing things down as opposed to perhaps having, you know, we've heard of Zoom fatigue or like having too many kind of online meetings. It's quite kind of really draining for people. Have you found that? Have you changed working practice quite?
Yes, we have. I mean, yes, we definitely found that too. It's incredibly draining. It's so much more exhausting to be staring at somebody on a small screen all day long than it is to like see them in person, at least for extroverts. So we found people responded differently, and we've been surveying our exos quite regularly. So I had a bunch of like introverted engineers in my team who thrived in this. They kind of wanted to work more from home in any case. So when the model flipped,
that's where like Wikipedia came from, right? Like
they loved it. They loved it. Well, there's some companies that are entirely distributed, and we can talk about that in a minute. So we definitely had some people who thrived. The extroverts amongst us, like, you know, myself and Astro definitely suffered because we're missing the kind of serendipity of just bumping into people in the corridors and having a little chat in the micro kitchen. But what we found is like, there's definitely some trends. So people love not commuting. You know, I was commuting an hour and a half each way from San Francisco down to Mountain View because the traffic was terrible. And then I ended up taking the train. The train's slow. It's a 1950s train in the middle of Silicon Valley. So they love the not commuting. They love being able to work from everywhere. Some people relocated, for instance, to be closer to family, right? So that they could have their parents to help with the kids. They also like the flexibility, especially for caregivers who are doing remote schooling. You know, like when I have my daughter with me, who's 7, like I don't have the same sort of back-to-back meeting day because I can't do that with her. Like she needs help. I need to engage with her. And so having that flexibility actually works really well for people. So it's hard to predict the future on this. Like, you know, anytime you try and predict it, is like you're likely to be wrong. But I think that the companies who are going to work out how to have this mix of like remote and in-office work and distributed work will have a real competitive advantage. So, and partly it's because we'll be able to attract talent in a different way. So if you think like the most competitive thing that we're all like fighting over is actually talent, right? It all comes down to the people that we work with, and finding the right people who will thrive in our environment is so hard. So right now we're asking them to join full time, and we're asking them to join in a particular location, like pick an office, right? Come here. So I moved continents when I joined X. So the question is, will that be necessary in future, right? So will we have these models where people can be part-time or work from home at least some of the time? I think that will make a huge difference. And I think it will also really help with diversity, because you can meet people with where they are. Not everybody wants to move to the Bay Area. So for instance, people of color say very explicitly, you know, the Bay Area is not a great place because there's such a small community of people of color, whereas they love living in Brooklyn or they love living in Atlanta, right? So I think that's a really interesting trend. So we have not yet made decisions at X. We've kind of learned in 2020 that it's so hard to plan ahead, right?
Yeah.
So in true X fashion, we'll probably experiment with different models, and we're going to see what works for us.
For sure. And the agility that comes with it. So there's like the side, I think, you know, of people maybe want that flexibility, and it's also ability to tap into like different pools of talent that you may not have been able to attract or to connect with before. And then also maybe it provides more flexibility for businesses, right? Especially if you move beyond just being a full-time employee, but maybe more freelancing or more part-time contract. I don't know, like, is that something that you guys do a bit?
Yes, we do.
You partner with universities and things too, don't you?
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I mean, it's like we're just too binary, right? It's like you're either in the office, you're not, or you know, you're full-time employed or you're not, right? Like we're going to move to more fluid models over time. And by we, I don't mean just our company. I think companies in general, right? So the freelancing is like we work with a lot of advisors. So at X, we love generalists, especially in the early stages, for two reasons. So one is they bring a certain level of naivete, right? Like if you want to tackle a problem with a new, fresh perspective, like sometimes being the expert is actually a hindrance. But we have advisors who are experts who basically can stop us from doing something stupid, right? Or sometimes short circuit something. So for instance, I had advisors who knew when we were working on Amber, who knew how to make medical devices, right? Because that's a regulated process. And if you don't know how that process works, like you're not going to get anywhere. But I also deliberately had people who knew nothing about medical devices because they could challenge some of the sort of classic norms. So that's a place where we have a lot of people who, you know, who are part-time, who are sometimes spending a day a week or two a week, or even just a few hours. I had an advisory board that met once a quarter, for instance. We do have some part-time workers too. I mean, I think, you know, like every company, but I think this fluidity of kind of figuring out as an individual of like, what is the way that I want to work? And then asking that of the companies to like be more accommodating, we're going to see a lot more of that. I think people are going to be much more assertive and much less like willing to just fit into an existing model. If you're moving to a more distributed model, like how do you empower people in that model, right? So there's one person that I think is an extraordinary expert on this, and that's Matt Mullenweg. He's the founder of Automatica, better known for WordPress, which is what about a third or 40% of the internet runs on. So if you haven't come across his work, I really recommend it. He has a great blog where he talks about distributed work. And he very deliberately doesn't call it remote work. He says remote work is sort of the old term that is implying there is an office and that's the norm. And then you've got these satellite people who are remote, right? And that's kind of like a second-class citizen. So Automatica doesn't have an office. Actually, I take that back. They bought Tumblr, which came with an office. So now at the moment they have an office in New York, which is the old Tumblr office.
Right, yeah.
But they are truly distributed. And so he talks about 5 levels of autonomy and of distributed working. So level 0 is your job is physical. There's no way you can do it autonomously, right? So then you're kind of stuck. Level 1 is what most companies were in the 90s, right? Like, yes, maybe occasionally you could work from home, or even in the 2000s, but they made it really hard. Like you had to like dial into some VPN and it was slow and it was really, really tedious, right? Level 2, you're recreating the office in a remote environment. And that's actually where most companies have gone to during COVID, right? So you're still pretending you're kind of like in an office, and that's why you've got all of your meetings just the same, right? You're just doing them on Zoom or Google Meet, which is incredibly painful and exhausting. So you kind of have to get through that level to the next level, which is more distributed. And at that level, like you might give your people specialist equipment. Like for instance, we got a stipend so we could buy a stand-up desk and a monitor and better audio equipment so people can actually hear you when you're on the VC. But it's also where things come in, like using docs. So like my team happened to be using docs for decision making already before, even when we were in the office, because there was a few of us who really love writing and love that process. But I think when you're in that kind of distributed way, it's like much more essential that you do that, right? And then level 4 is like where it's truly asynchronous. So like Automatica is that where people can work from anywhere. He talks about work following the sun around the world. So stuff happens not necessarily live and synchronous, but it happens like over time in the 24 hours cycle.
Absolutely. And this is, if you like, the Hoxby model where, on the project at the moment, we have people in Asia as well as in Europe and the States, and that really happens. It means the client service is 24 hours a day, and it means you can't just jump on a meeting when you need to do. So like also when you go on a meeting, I think these guys will talk about it as well, but that knowledge is only shared with one person, whereas if you write it down in whether it's in a doc or in a Slack thread, we do a lot of our work through that everyone gets to see it as well. And so like people can build this knowledge over time. You're not answering the same questions.
Exactly. And you can go back to it. Matt talks about that too. That you can go back to, like when an engineer comes along and says, oh, we should change this feature. You can say, yes, we could change the feature, but like, have a look at all the discussion that went into the feature in the first place, so that you don't kind of reinvent the wheel over and over.
It feels like this actually helps move like humanity forward, doesn't it? Rather than just making our same mistakes over and over again.
And then level 5 is what he calls nirvana, right? Like that's when everyone in the company has time for like wellness and working on their mental health, and when you bring your best selves to work, and when you have more fun. So that's like the other thing. I think level 2 autonomy has just not been very much fun, like just sitting on video calls all day long. How can we reintroduce some of the fun that we maybe had more naturally in the office, right? Like at X, we do things like dress up days, right? Like, so we celebrated, for instance, like this May 4th was Star Wars Day, and tons of people would dress up, right? Or we had a charity thing where it was called Pi Day, on Pi Day. So
there's a Pi Day?
There's a Pi Day, yes. I cannot actually remember what Pi Day is, but Google it, you'll find Pi Day. Well, I guess it's 314. Yeah, it's like it's like the first digits of the number pi.
Not like a chicken pie. No, like
1 year, no, but we did celebrate Pi Day by doing like a pie in the face contest. So people volunteered to have a pie thrown in their face for charity. And we raised an extraordinary amount of money, and it was super fun and kind of, just an extraordinary day.
Really doesn't work with a webcam and a laptop.
Does not work with a webcam. So how can you introduce that kind of fun?
How can you do that?
Like how do you do like offsites, for instance? I mean, I did one with my team recently where we made pizza. And so we sent the people who were like capable of making pizza dough, made their own. People who said, oh my God, I have no idea how to cook. We actually sent them a kit from a local restaurant, which is also
like levels
nice
of pizza making ability.
Exactly. So it was nice because we were supporting the local business, who obviously like the restaurants have been really hit. And so we made the pizza at home, like at the same time. And it turned out one of our machine learning researchers grew up, when he grew up, like his parents had a restaurant. So he absolutely knew how to make pizza. He'd made like thousands and thousands of pizzas in his life, and he showed everyone else. And that was kind of wonderful, because we never would have like known that about him, right? Like he never talked about it. So you can recreate some of the fun online.
For sure. And actually just, being in your home when you're talking to your colleagues, in a way you can't bring that more professional, maybe mask that you might otherwise do to work. You sort of, especially, I don't know, like you see your kids and parent and pets and things and all of that stuff around. So in a way, there's like that window into different people's lives that actually can be more authentic, perhaps.
Yes, very much so, and much richer. I mean, I actually think back to one meeting. It was the meeting when I told my team that we were shutting down Amber. So it was a very serious meeting. Everyone was really somber and really sad. And then my son came in and started playing with the cat. And like everyone could see him, he was behind me. And I turned around and I was like, Casper, can you leave?
Yeah, it's
And he's like, oh, I just wanted a cat cuddle. And someone on the call said, I just want a cat cuddle now. And everyone laughed. And it just sort of, it broke the sadness, and it was like we were able to deal with it in a different way. And actually it made that meeting better rather than worse, like because he intruded.
Yeah. And what's the sort of the future then for you? I know it's difficult to predict, but like, what would you like? What would be your ideal way of working in the future? I mean, we talk about work styles, the complete, ability to choose when and where you work. Is that what you want? Or are you looking forward to getting back in the,
for me personally?
So
I want both, but I think I want to be able to work when I want. And then I also want to be able to get together. So, and even fully distributed companies, you still need to get people together. But I think it'd be really interesting. Like, what if we flipped it, right? Like, so people typically think, oh, we want to have meetings together. I actually think meetings are pretty good remote, as long as you do some things like having good meeting notes and having good agendas and so on, which frankly, we should have in a physical environment anyway. So the bit I want is I want to work from home, say 4 days a week. And then 1 day a week, I want to come into the office on a day where we have no meetings. And we did institute, we made Wednesdays no meetings day at X. So Wednesday is the day I would want to be in the office, because people wouldn't be just sitting in meeting rooms all day long, but they would be milling about, right? And I would be able to just walk up to somebody at their desk and like have a chat. So I think it's like, actually, if you tipped it on its head, it would be much more effective. And so if you have no office, right, then getting the team together for like brainstorming sessions and offsites and so on is I think the way to go. And like, think if you don't have an office, you can afford so much. That's like huge cost, right? That you're cutting out the company. So you can spend a lot of money on travel and offsites.
For sure. Because the office economics don't work very well if everyone's only in it 1 day a week, or at least you shrink it down.
Well, I mean, you can shrink it down. So I'm on the board of a company, Springer Nature, and it's a publishing business, right? So there's a huge amount of desk work, editorial work, and actually a lot of their employees like told us in the employee surveys that they love working from home and not having a commute, etc. So we're thinking about like, should we shrink the office, and should we just allow people to do that? It means you don't get your own desk, right? You don't get to have your desk with like your picture on it and all your stuff underneath it, etc. You have to be willing to share. But I did that in consulting in the 90s because we were on client side. So like our office, I think, could only accommodate a quarter of the consultants at any one time. So people came in on different days. Fridays was usually the most packed.
You can never get a desk on a Friday, for sure.
Exactly.
That's the thing at Accenture. Yeah.
Great.
Obi, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic, fascinating conversation. Hopefully we'll invite you back on the podcast again soon, but I certainly look forward to seeing what you get up to next. I'm sure you probably can't talk much about it, but I hope you go through that. You're through the grieving process around Amber.
I am.
At the moment. I'm sure there's some exciting.
I can tell you what I'm working on right now. So I'm doing special projects for Astra right now, and I'm actually doing leadership recruiting. So I'm looking for more people to join X. So if anyone in the listeners is interested, you should get in touch with me on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. And do they need to be in California, or are you recruiting?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? Like, I think at the moment we're still assuming that they will be, but let's pressure test that.
There we go. Brilliant. Well, there you go, everyone.
Thanks, Ben.
We'll get in touch. Okay. Thanks very much, Obi.
Bye.
Bye-bye.